Salutations, friends, and here we are with research paper. I haven't done a research paper in a long time, and we are overdue. Thank you for being here. As you see in front of you, this is International Journal of Law and Psychiatry in regards to pedophilic disorder. This is a very important subject to be talking about at this time, and in order to help us ground ourselves in, especially with the amount of information that we're receiving, and being able to digest it in a way that is objective and by those who are more informed than we are, who have used their profession in a way to help be able to diagnose and understand pedophilic disorder. And there are 3 different types of pedophilic disorders, which they're going to go through on here. But what's important to understand is you have to know what your sources are. So here we have the International Journal of Law and Psychiatry. This was published in 2026. We have 7 different people, both male and female, from different disciplines. So it's a holistic approach, a multidisciplinary approach to better understand in order to create laws that are specific, that are detailed, and that are needed in order to treat and to give the proper sentence. So here we have Neuroscience Center, General Psychology, Department of Law, IMT School for Advanced Studies, which I want to say that and the RCCS are both doing with brain imagery, and Department of Human Neurosciences. We're going to see here that the article is part of a special issue. It's been published in International Journal of Law and Psychiatry. And they do have their own work in here. So they say that specifically, which is good. But the amount of sources that they have is phenomenal, comprehensive, and multidisciplined. So here we go. As you see the references they have here, we have the American Psychiatry Association, hypersexuality after bilateral deep brain stimulation. So you have that Scarpazza, so they're right here as well. We have here Neuroscience and Law, Rethinking Responsibility in Offenders with Acquired Pedophilia. And then we have these sources as well. So well-rounded sources, objective, professional, which is what we need right now. So here's the abstract. Assessing insanity in individuals with pedophilic disorder presents unique challenges, particularly due to the diverse etiologies of the condition, which lead to varying symptomology and behavioral manifestations. To address this complexity, in this article, we overview the characteristics of 3 variants of pedophilic disorder: idiopathic, acquired, and iatrogenic, and highlight the key obstacles in differentiating these forms, resulting in inconsistent and, at times, biased judicial outcomes. Through the analysis of 3 real-life case studies, we illustrate how forensic evaluations must go beyond a one-size-fits-all approach. Thank you. Integrating neuropsychological and neuroimaging assessment to provide more precise determinations of criminal responsibility. Bingo. We therefore propose a cognitive model for the forensic assessment of insanity that emphasizes the role of scientific evidence in distinguishing cases in which neurological conditions or medical treatments significantly impair volitional and cognitive capacities. In such cases, incarceration may be inappropriate, as incarceration hinders rehabilitation. while treatment in specialized non-custodial facilities could better address the underlying condition and reduce the risk of recidivism. In our analysis, we argue for the inclusion of a criterion in the DSM to ensure that the symptoms of pedophilic disorders are not due to substance effects or other medical conditions. Finally, we propose guidelines for forensic assessments of insanity in child sexual offenses that support a multidisciplinary approach based on the cognitive model. In this framework, behavioral analysis, neuropsychological assessment, and, if necessary, neuroimaging techniques are combined to assess how the condition affects self-determination, ultimately leading to more accurate and scientifically informed legal decisions. Thank you. Now, I want to bring this up of this current event here. Hernando County. January 6th rioter pardoned by Trump cries while getting life sentence for molesting children. This was March 5th. This was recent. A Florida handyman who was sentenced on Thursday to life in prison for molesting 2 children has been convicted of storming the Capitol on January 6, 2021, but was pardoned by President Donald Trump. Pedophile protecting. Power and control. Perpetuating the problem. And then we'll get into this guy too. Tim Tebow. So we finished that. Fabulous start. So that was the abstract. So here we have pedophilic disorder, introduction, and evaluation issues. Child sexual offending, CSO, is an ever-present and globally widespread problem. And I just want to say real quick, thankfully, that judge did the right thing. Because unfortunately, when it comes to this globally, many have to be involved in order to keep these pedophiles out of jail. And we're going to find out the differences between the types of pedophilia. But the type that we see, like in the Jeffrey Epstein class and those in positions of power, need to be in life prison, life sentencing, no insanity plea. And we're going to learn why and how. So the phenomenon is often automatically associated with pedophilic behavior, exhibited by individuals who are sexually attracted by children and consciously and voluntarily commit offenses against them. However, this perception is flawed for several reasons. First, it is necessary to distinguish between sexual offending against children as a crime, which can be committed without any sexual interest, and pedophilia, which is considered a sexual preference and is not necessarily expressed through abusing behavior. Research and case studies have indeed consistently shown that not all pedophiles commit abuse. And conversely, not all child sexual offenders have a primary sexual interest in children. Second, it is important to differentiate between the diagnosis of pedophilia and the diagnosis of pedophilic disorder, a distinction that is complicated by the ongoing debate about diagnostic criteria that inevitably spill over into the legal realm, where there is still no clear methodology for assessing the cognitive integrity of a person accused of CSO, which is a damn shame. But I mentioned I was going to look into the laws. I want to say that the majority of the laws put in place were to protect a specific type of pedophilia. And it started with, which we talked before on this channel, J. Edgar Hoover, who strategically put out stranger danger, which is not true. The victims know of their perpetrator. It is rare for that to happen, but that rarity we'll get into. He put in place for these types of pedophiles to get away with what they've been getting away with for decades. And we also learned that this isn't anything new. So, third, pedophilic behavior can present in 3 distinct forms: idiopathic, acquired, and iatrogenic. And let's go over what that means. They also will help you, but idiopathic refers to a disease or condition with an unknown spontaneous cause, while iatrogenic refers to an illness or injury caused specifically by medical examination, treatment, or the actions of a healthcare provider. Idiopathic means of unknown origin, whereas iatrogenic means doctor-induced, which we'll get into more of the doctor-induced, which is like medication, mostly medication-induced. But I want to put this out there because they don't mention this in this article, in the empirical article. But this guy, Tim Tebow, he just recently testified a Senate hearing on child trafficking 4 days ago. Former NFL player Tim Tebow opening statement at subcommittee hearing on child trafficking. The question is, will we actually accept the responsibility of caring for these boys and girls and truly protecting them? Or are we just going to continue to talk about it? Now, if you know anything about Tim Tebow, during his college spring breaks, this is what he does on his spring break. In the late 2000s, Tim Tebow assisted doctors with medical procedures, including circumcisions, at his father's orphanage in the Philippines. Tebow aiming to help with needed medical care. Why? Described the experience as nerve-wracking but necessary to aid the impoverished children. So he's playing martyr and predator at the same time. It was part of his missionary work right here. Participated in mission work. Why is there so much religion with pedophilia? Which I do have another paper to talk about that with in the next research paper. But here he is trying to save the children when he himself is part of doing circumcisions. And circumcision, that is a traumatic event on a newborn, which I'll be interested if someone looks into that. And there's also female circumcision as well. And that was talked about, I want to say in the 90s, early 2000s. For what comes to my mind is it happening in Africa. So we cannot forget that either, because we cannot forget. We have to keep talking about this. And like he says, are we going to talk about it and do action? Well, we need to do actions against him, as well as the others. And we have to do that by getting more involved in our local government and knowing what they can do for us. Instead of book clubs, let's have government clubs. Second, it is important to differentiate between the diagnosis of pedophilia and the diagnosis of pedophilic disorder, which we just read. Third, pedophilic behavior can present in 3 distinct forms: idiopathic, acquired, and iatrogenic, each with a unique etiology. Idiopathic Pedophilic behavior differs from the acquired and iatrogenic forms primarily in the symptoms, with behavioral and cognitive differences being particularly pronounced. The actual diagnostic criteria for pedophilic disorder are innovative and problematic at the same time. The innovation consists in the depathologization of pedophilia, pathologization of pedophilia in the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM-5. Pedophilia is presented as a mere sexual interest in prepubescent children that is not considered pathological. Indeed, the DSM-5 differentiates pedophilia from pedophilic disorder, with the latter requiring that A, the individual has acted on his sexual urges, B, or the sexual urges or fantasies cause marked distress or interpersonal difficulty, which is very general. That's not specific. And psychiatry is very specific. We need to start getting more specific. The sexual urge may be exclusive, directed only towards children, or non-exclusive, also involving attraction to adults, or incestuous, specifically involving sexual interest in children who are biologically related to the offender. Despite this clear innovation, which has been retained in the most recent edition of the manual, DSM-5, the diagnostic criteria are still problematic. Indeed, crucial criteria such as intensity, duration, and focus of symptoms, which are typically used to define psychiatric disorders, have not yet been specified for pedophilic disorder, complicating forensic and clinical assessments. Furthermore, unlike most DSM-5-TR diagnoses, such as anxiety disorders, depressive disorders, obsessive-compulsive disorders, or psychotic disorders, pedophilic disorders has neither a differential subcategory, such as due to another medical condition, nor an exclusion criterion, such as symptoms are not due to the physiological effects of a substance or other medical or neurological condition that considers a possible iatrogenic or acquired etiology, which is a damn shame. So anything that's medical has to have a due to or a related to or a not due to, and in the DSM-5 it is not specified, which unfortunately I have to say I believe it's because it was done that way purposefully. There have been many doctors who have sold out and are helping these pedophiles. Another clear example is the doctor for the U.S. gymnastics team. Coaches, Penn State. There was pedophilia with that, but there was no doctor, but there was a coach. People with positions of power, but specifically doctors. I went off on a tangent there almost. While the issues discussed demonstrate the clinical and forensic complexities of assessing perpetrators of sexual violence against children, in real-world practice, diagnoses are often inferred from observed or documented abusive behavior alone. Systematic inquiry into sexual interest, including detailed assessment of fantasies, urges, frequency, and intensity, is indeed frequently omitted, which those are specifics. Also, the modus operandi, which can be considered an expression of the cognitive status of the offender, is rarely analyzed, despite its important forensic implication. Furthermore, the potential neurological or iatrogenic origin of pedophilic impulses is almost never explicitly ruled out, as the acquired and iatrogenic forms are still largely unknown. And you can definitely rule out the acquired and iatrogenic forms very easily by using medical interventions. This, in turn, leads to legal outcomes that are not always appropriate, with significant implications for both the defendant and the victims. Consequently, a complex and multidisciplinary approach is urgently needed to reduce errors and minimize biases of the insanity assessment. So, idiopathic versus acquired and iatrogenic pedophilic disorder and overview. The most up-to-date scientific literature recognizes three forms of pedophilic disorder: idiopathic, also known as developmental, acquired, and iatrogenic. Idiopathic pedophilic disorder is characterized by a persistent sexual interest in prepubescent children that typically emerges during puberty or adolescence, without a clear underlying medical cause. The sexual interest either generates discomfort in an individual or ultimately results in an acting out of the impulse. Despite its relatively low prevalence, estimated at 3 to 5% of the male population, individuals with idiopathic pedophilic disorder are responsible for a disproportionately high number of offenses and show low compliance with psychological treatment. So 3 to 5% do the most damage, which sounds like the Epstein class. It's a class of people who are doing the most damage. Acquired pedophilic disorder is a rare condition that refers to the sudden onset of pedophilic behavior in adults with no prior sexual interest in children and is usually due to neurological disorders. The prevalence and incidence of acquired pedophilic and pedophilic disorder remains unknown due to the rarity and limited research investigation. Iatrogenic pedophilic disorder is an even rare disorder in which pedophilic urges or behaviors occur as an unintended consequence of medical treatments. This form is characterized by its onset following medical intervention and potentially reversibility upon treatment adjustment. The prevalence of this disorder depends on the rarity of the underlying pathology and the pharmacological treatments involved. In the following paragraphs, we will summarize the main differences between the three forms of pedophilic disorder. However, as the scientific literature on iatrogenic variant is still very scant, the majority of the following sections will focus on the differences between idiopathic and acquired pedophilic disorders. And part of the reason why this is rare is because of the guilt, the shame, the consequence, or it's unknown. It's unknown because people see it and don't say anything. So the etiology. The primary distinction between these three variants of the disorder lies in their etiology. Idiopathic pedophilic disorder is classified as a psychiatric condition which, as such, is considered to have a multifactorial etiology. Multiple hypotheses have been proposed to explain its origins, including genetic predisposition, exposed to stressful events, testosterone imbalances, neurochemical alterations, and subtle brain abnormalities. In addition, some studies suggest that childhood experiences of sexual abuse may be a risk factor for the developmental of pedophilic tendencies, although the results are inconsistent, which is true because some of those who, especially the ones who are violent, had this happen to them when they were younger, and it totally changes them, of course, and then they abuse. But not all people who are abused sexually end up abusing as well. Just like with the Idaho 4 with Xana and Maddie. Just because their parents had issues with drugs does not mean that they're going to have issues with drugs. Also, people within this environment who are being sexually abused may not even think it's abuse because it was done when they were younger and they're in the environment where it perpetuates it. And they think it's normal, even though on the inside they know it's wrong. And then what happens is the dynamic switches. Now they get to be the predator. So it's multifaceted. So where was I? In addition, some studies suggest that childhood experience of sexual abuse may be a risk factor for the development of pedophilic tendencies, although the results are inconsistent. For instance, found that individuals with pedophilic interest who had offended reported a greater number of adverse childhood experiences than both child sexual offenders without pedophilic interests and healthy controls. Importantly, even those with pedophilic interest who had never offended reported elevated rates of childhood sexual abuse. It is therefore important to distinguish between correlation and causation, as not all individuals who have experienced childhood sexual abuse develop pedophilic interests, and many individuals with pedophilic disorders do not report a history of abuse, which they might not know it's abuse, or they're too afraid to say anything, or they may have forgotten, don't remember. In contrast, no such developmental risk factors have been identified in acquired or iatrogenic pedophilic disorder. Acquired pedophilic disorder develops as a symptom of an identifiable neurological condition, such as brain tumors, traumatic injuries, or neurodegenerative diseases. In contrast to idiopathic cases, no comorbid psychiatric disorders were observed in individuals with acquired pedophilic disorder, and no psychological or genetic influences were suspected. So we're talking about acquired pedophilic disorders. It develops as a symptom of an identifiable neurological condition, such as a brain tumor, traumatic injury, or neurodegenerative disease. But with idiopathic cases, there are no comorbid psychiatric disorders, and no psychological or genetic influences were suspected. And lastly, iatrogenic pedophilic disorder arises from interventions targeting neurological conditions, such as the use of high doses of dopamine agonists or the application of deep brain stimulation, DBS, in disorders like Parkinson's disease. So the iatrogenic, you can understand that there is a cause for it, as well as the acquired. But when it comes to the idiopathic, there is none. There are no psychological or genetic influences or disorders. Whereas with the iatrogenic and the acquired, there is a underlying medical cause. Medical and psychological. Overall, iatrogenic and acquired pedophilic disorders are fundamentally linked to organic and/or neurological conditions, whereas idiopathic pedophilic disorder falls under the domain of psychiatric disorder. Onset. Idiopathic pedophilic disorder is characterized by a lifelong and stable pedophilic interest that usually begins in adolescence. Conversely, acquired pedophilic disorder refers to a sexual urge towards children that emerges later in life as a consequence of a neurological condition with a well-defined etiology, resulting in a behavioral fracture, a clear shift in observable behavior before and after the onset of the brain disease, and that's acquired pedophilic. This marked shift, often observed after the age of 50, is sufficiently evident to serve as a red flag for clinicians, prompting suspicion of acquired pedophilic disorder. Similarly, iatrogenic pedophilic disorder arises in response to medical or pharmacological treatment, creating a distinct pre- and post-treatment behavioral profile. As this condition has been predominantly linked to the use of dopamine agonists for the treatment of Parkinson's disease, its onset is also late in life, typically exceeding middle age. And it's funny because I'm seeing Clinton and Trump getting the shakes, and it's being put out there that he may have Parkinson's. But both Clinton and Trump have been doing this for a long time. So if this is what they're trying to do. Because their time is coming. Tick-tock. It may not be as quickly as you would like it to come, and it may not happen in the way that we would like for it to happen, but it's going to happen. So modus operandi. Another important distinction concerns the modus operandi. Offenders with idiopathic pedophilic disorder typically employ a predatory approach. Specifically, an idiopathic pedophile's modus operandi is characterized by actively seeking out victims. For instance, relying on factors like vulnerability, suggestibility, and familiarity, following meticulous planning of their actions. For instance, meticulously selecting the location and time for committing abuse. Hello, Epstein Island. Hello, Zorro Ranch. The Upper East Side townhouse. The apartment in Paris. When can we get to the island? When are we going to the island? Furthermore, they strive to conceal their behavior by coercing victims into silence, often using psychological and/or physical violence. Notably, they frequently attempt to deny their actions, even when apprehended. It is also noteworthy that they perceive their sexual attraction to children as egocentric, which means that their behavior, values, and emotions are experienced in harmony with their individual needs, or are considered consistent with their ideal self-image. Therefore, in idiopathic pedophilia offenders, there is usually no sense of guilt, which is exactly what we're dealing with today when it comes to the Epstein class and those who are in position of power. They know what they're doing and they like what they're doing, and they're not going to stop what they're doing. They know it's wrong, but they don't care. That's why they need to go to prison for life. They are predators, and they like it. In sharp contrast, individuals with acquired pedophilic disorder display impulsive and disinhibited behavior, usually acting without planning the assaults. I haven't read an article like this in a while, so I'm going to fumble some. And without attempting to mask their criminal conduct. So they act without planning their assaults, and they do it without trying to hide it, their criminal conduct. They just do it. Moreover, instead of actively selecting victims, these are passively identified according to proximity criteria. So it's opportunistic. These individuals therefore commit violence against children they find within their reach, despite the high risk of being caught. This impulsive and disorganized modus operandi corresponds to two of the red flags identified in the literature as indicative of acquired pedophilic disorder: the absence of attempts to conceal the crime and the lack of premeditation. Individuals with acquired pedophilic disorder may, in some cases, recognize the inappropriateness or wrongfulness of their impulses, but remain unable to resist them. which often results in feelings of guilt and distress. Okay, well, that makes sense. The idiopathics, they don't. In other cases, however, such individuals experience no guilt or moral conflict, as their cognitive impairments prevent them from fully grasping the moral and legal significance of their actions. So they just may not know better because they don't have the capacity to understand, fully comprehend it, which the people of the Epstein class and the administration and those who are protecting them and who are a part of it, they are well aware. Very well aware of their actions. Very well aware that they are going to get in some major trouble. And they're doing everything they can to not. Neural correlates. Another critical distinction between idiopathic and acquired pedophilic disorder pertains to their neural correlates. According to Manock, idiopathic pedophilic disorder is not marked by prominent anatomical anomalies, but by functional alterations and minor structural changes in the brain. Studies comparing individuals with idiopathic pedophilic disorder to non-pedophilic controls have reported volume reductions in regions central to sexual arousal, including the right amygdala and hypothalamus, as well as in the septal regions and temporal cortices, alongside structural deficits in the fibra tracts. Additional anomalies have been identified in the orbital frontal cortex, basal ganglia, cingulate cortex, insula, and cerebellum. However, a coordinated-based meta-analysis by Scarpazza, Finos, et al. In 2021 found no reliable neural basis for idiopathic pedophilic disorder, revealing no consistent brain abnormalities. This lack of a reliable neural basis in idiopathic pedophilic disorder is noteworthy, as it contrasts with other psychiatric diagnoses that have well-documented structural and functional brain alterations. So the idiopathic does not have any signs of structural and functional brain alterations, while the other two, acquired and the iatrogenic, do. Conversely, acquired paraphilic disorder is inherently associated with structural brain abnormalities, which play a central role in its diagnosis. Importantly, the existence of a strong temporal link between the onset of the neurological insult, resulting in evident abnormalities, and the insurgence of pedophilic tendencies is critical for the diagnosis, as pedophilic behaviors occur de novo in a person who has not exhibited pedophilic impulses or inclinations in the past. Particularly noteworthy in the field in the study by Scarpazza identified a network whose functioning is altered in acquired pedophilic disorder, despite the heterogeneous location of the lesions, such as orbital frontal cortex, amygdala, globus pallidus, hippocampus. This network encompasses the orbital frontal cortex, the posterior midline structures, the right inferior temporal gyrus, and the left fusiform gyrus. These regions play crucial roles in social cognition and impulse control. So those parts of the brain that was just mentioned correlate with social cognition and impulse control. On the other hand, social cognition refers to the complex set of mental processes that enable individuals to understand, interact, and navigate the social world. It includes the ability to perceive interpret, and respond to social cues, including the thoughts, emotions, and intentions of others. This multifaceted cognitive domain involves various skills such as theory of mind, emotion recognition, empathy, and moral reasoning. Thank you. This is the importance of having specifics and not generalizing. On the other hand, impulse control is a critical cognitive function that enables individuals to regulate their behavior, resist urges, and make decisions that align with long-term goals and social norms, which there are specific therapies for that. Neuropsychological profile. Regarding the neuropsychological cognitive profile, a meta-analysis revealed that people with idiopathic pedophilic disorder manifest impairments in set switching and impulse regulation. However, these impairments were found to have a small effect size and occur in an artificial environment using non-ecological cognitive tests. Therefore, they are likely insufficient to result in a significant lack of impulse control in daily life. Conversely, a systematic review of individuals with acquired CSO revealed that impulsivity was the most consistently observed characteristic, with over half of the cases also exhibiting deficits in social cognition, particularly in moral reasoning. These neuropsychological impairments were substantiated through formal assessments and further corroborated by observations of everyday impulsive behavior reported by relatives. These findings highlight the widespread nature of these deficits, which significantly affect observable behavior and everyday activities. The combination of evidence from structured assessments and real-world observations underscores the pervasive impact of these cognitive and behavioral dysfunctions on the individual's daily functioning. So that's the acquired. It's deeply embedded. It's part of their everyday life. It can be seen. Whereas the idiopathic, they hide and lie and be deceitful. And those have symptoms as well. Treatment approaches. The final notable difference between idiopathic and acquired pedophilic disorder pertains to their respective treatment approaches. For idiopathic pedophilic disorder, treatment must focus on directly addressing the disorder itself. The primary interventions shown to have some efficacy in addressing pedophilic arousal include cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and pharmacological treatments. CBT aims to help individuals identify and modify problematic thought patterns and behaviors, equipping them with strategies to reduce the risk of offending. Pharmacological options such as anti-androgens, gonadotropin releasing hormone, agonists, and selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors target libido and pedophilic urges, complementing the psychotherapeutic approach. So you need layers to help with that. You need CBT therapy and pharmacological interventions. However, the success of idiopathic pedophilic disorder treatment is contingent upon several factors. These include the individual's intrinsic motivation to engage in therapy and adhere to the treatment plan. Right? They have to want to get better, as well as systemic barriers such as a lack of individualized care tailored to specific needs. True. Compounding these challenges are societal stigma and the fear of rejection. Issues that may deter individuals from seeking help despite their willingness to undergo treatment. Research indicates that societal judgment and negative perceptions of individuals with pedophilic tendencies can significantly hinder their access to professional support, exacerbating risk and psychological distress. Which, yes, at one time they were at a point let's just say their humanity is still there underneath all of that. Let's give them that. It doesn't excuse their behavior and the actions they have done. But you can be in prison and get all those psychological, the treatment, and as well as the pharmacological. And these people I want to say seem to me to be the types of people that would say things like people who have depression or anxiety, well, just get over it. Just stop. What's the problem? Just don't do it. See how they hide behind others, if you get what I'm saying. Acquired pedophilic disorder, as well as iatrogenic, being symptoms themselves, can often be managed by addressing the underlying pathology that causes the condition. For example, if a brain tumor, lesion, or other identifiable abnormality is identified as a source of the pedophilic behavior, surgical intervention or medical management may resolve the behavior entirely, leading to a restitutio ad integrum. However, in instances where neurological damage is irreversible, or when behavioral patterns persist despite lesion removal, additional therapeutic measures may be necessary. These may include psychopharmacological interventions or behavioral therapies to manage residual symptoms such as impulsivity or emotional dysregulation, which makes sense. They've had this going on for years. They get rid of the lesion or the tumor. It's not going to just disappear totally, but it can be managed. You got rid of the underlying cause. There is a starting point. This stark difference in treatment options underscores a fundamental distinction between idiopathic pedophilic disorder and acquired pedophilic disorder in terms of risk assessment as well. While the management of the former focuses on long-term risk reduction and behavioral control without ultimate cure. The latter disorder offers the potential for a complete resolution if the neurological cause is effectively addressed. Overall, the 6 topics discussed highlight substantial differences between idiopathic pedophilic disorder and acquired or iatrogenic pedophilic disorder, each carrying significant legal and ethical implications. These distinctions profoundly impact therapeutic goals, prognosis, individual culpability, and risk assessment, all of which can vary considerably between the 2-3 conditions. Okay, so before you go into case study, let's look at the table. And this is a summary of the characteristics of idiopathic, acquired, and iatrogenic pedophilic disorders. So for idiopathic here, the etiology, it's neurodevelopmental origin, no clear and unambiguous cause, possibly genetic, hormonal, or neurodevelopmental factors. Whereas acquired is secondary to neurological damage, such as brain tumors, traumatic brain injury, neurodegenerative diseases, as well as iatrogenic is induced by pharmacological or non-pharmacological treatment, typically targeting dopamine centers for Parkinson's disease. Then we have the onset. For idiopathic, it's lifelong, usually emerging in adolescence. Acquired pedophilic disorder, sudden onset following brain pathology, typically in mid to late adulthood. And iatrogenic coincides with the start of medical treatment for an underlying condition. Impulsive, driven by pharmacological disinhibitions, lack of planning or intent. Offenses often committed in inappropriate social context. And I read that extra, the impulsiveness, that's the modus operandi. I just kept going. So the idiopathic, the modus operandi is highly premeditated and strategic, deliberate victim selection, grooming techniques, and precautions to avoid detection. This is what we're dealing with right now. Acquired is impulsive, disorganized actions, no grooming or planning, victim selection often passive and based on proximity. And iatrogenic is also impulsive, driven by pharmacological disinhibition, lack of planning or intent, offenses often committed in inappropriate social contexts. For neural correlates, for idiopathic, subtle functional or structural brain changes, some studies suggest reduction in limbic and frontal structures, but no consistent biomarkers. So the limbic is like they say the reptilian brain. That's where your fight or flight, your basic actions of like breathing, digestion, all that, which it's funny that I'm thinking about it. Reptilian brain, Obama said that a lot during his administration. Acquired is marked structural abnormalities in a resting state, functionally connected network, including the OFC, posterior midline structures, RITG, and the IFG. And then iatrogenic is no specific structural abnormalities, functional disturbances due to medical intervention, usually of dopaminergic pathways. And for the neuropsychological profile, for idiopathic, generally intact intellectual and executive functioning. So no executive dysfunction. It is functioning. Some studies report mild inhibitory deficits, fully aware of their illegality and immortality of their actions, able to inhibit behavior when at risk of detection. For acquired, they're often unaware of their immorality, and illegality of their actions, inability to foresee the consequences and self-regulate. In iatrogenic, often unaware of their immorality and illegality of their actions, inability to foresee the consequences and self-regulate. So the same as the acquired. And for response to treatment, idiopathic, difficult to treat. Current interventions have low compliance and mixed effectiveness. Life in prison. Acquired, potentially full remission if the underlying neurological pathway is treated. And iatrogenic, often reversible upon discontinuation or adjustment of the causative medication. I need to go back for the cases. All right, so case studies. The following analysis of 3 real court cases, each representing one of the forms of the disorder, provides a practical lens through which to examine the complexities of assessing insanity and pedophilic disorders and offers valuable insights into the interplay between clinical assessment and legal considerations. A case of idiopathic pedophilic disorder. In 2014, a 30-year-old British man was arrested for luring and sexually abusing at least 71 children. Estimate reached 200, between the ages of 6 months and 12 years, the majority of whom came from the most depraved areas of a Malaysian city. The court hearing uncovered various tactics the man used to attract his victims, including falsely presenting himself as a philanthropist, and an English teacher, to gain parents' trust and collect children from their homes. Some of the abuses were documented and shared on the dark web. In addition, a list was found on his computer where the man complacently claimed to have perpetuated sexual violence of various kinds on 191 girls and boys. The man's modus operandi was characterized by performing criminal acts in a logical, reasoned, and predatory manner. Indeed, the man spontaneously revealed the careful way he selected his victims and clarified the rationale behind his predilection for places with high poverty rates, stating that impoverished boys are much easier to seduce than middle-class boys. He also confessed to having planned a continuation of the abuse. Ultimately, ahead of his sentencing, he told a psychiatrist that he wanted to put his madness behind him and settle down with a woman from South India. However, isn't that Epstein? He somehow became an English teacher at a prominent school. That claim was directly contradicted by a 2013 online post in which he outlined a deliberate strategy to marry one of his victims as a means to facilitate further abuse. A case of acquired pedophilic disorder. In 2011, an Italian 64-year-old pediatrician with no criminal record was charged with child abuse after he was caught in the act of sexually inappropriate behavior towards a little girl during a medical examination in his office at a kindergarten. The abuse was carried out in a completely disorganized manner. The man, in fact, had left the office door wide open, so someone saw something and said something. At the time of the arrest, the physician was unaware of the social and legal implications of his actions and merely asked his secretary to postpone appointments with patients until the following day. Yeah, he's not with it. Neurological and psychiatric examinations conducted during the house arrest revealed asymmetric motor reflexes, tunnel vision, diplopia, pathological crying, behavioral disinhibition, irritability, childish and obsessive compulsive behavior, alterations in emotion attribution, moral reasoning, and abstract thinking. The wife's report also revealed increased irritability and frustration over the past 2 years, followed by subtle behavioral disinhibitions, such as he had been caught stealing postcards from museums. In addition, his wife had discovered him openly surfing child pornography websites without taking any precautions not to be caught. Yeah, I mean, that sounds like an escalation of unknowingly escalating behavior. I'm not going to harp on the wife for not saying something. Thankfully, someone saw something, said something in the office with the little girl, thankfully. The unique combination of neurological and neuropsychological symptoms prompted the consulting team to conduct a structural MRI scan, which revealed the presence of a clivus chordoma, namely a brain tumor. This tumor was exerting significant pressure on critical brain regions, including the orbitofrontal cortex, one of the pivotal areas for impulse control and moral reasoning, in the hypothalamus, which plays a role in regulating sexual orientation. In addition, the tumor was pressing on the optic chiasma, which caused the visual impairments reported by the man. After surgical resection of the chordoma, all observed abnormalities, including behavioral, neurological, and neuropsychological disorders, as well as pedophilic urges, disappeared completely. After the operation, the patient regained full awareness of the moral wrongfulness of his actions and expressed deep remorse and shame for his behavior. Oh, dang. I couldn't even imagine. All of a sudden you come out of surgery, you come to who you are for the first time in a few years. Like the wife said, it's been a few years. And then you find out what you did. Yikes. Not idiopathic. The opposite of idiopathic. A case of iatrogenic pedophilic disorder. A few years ago, a 57-year-old Italian man was prosecuted for engaging in sexually inappropriate behavior towards pre-adolescents and adolescents. The reported actions included using social media to contact teenagers, sending sexually explicit messages and videos, and engaging in inappropriate physical contact at a local fishing lake he frequented as a hobby. The man, an only child raised in a low socioeconomic environment, exhibited significant developmental delays during childhood, including delayed motor milestones, language acquisition, and limited social independence. His overall intellectual functioning was at the lower end of the normal range, with an IQ of 77. Family members described him as lacking personal and social autonomy, unable to live independently or to form meaningful relationships. The inappropriate behavior emerged immediately following drug therapy for Gordon-Holmes syndrome, GHS, a rare genetic disorder characterized by cerebellar atrophy and hypogonadotropic hypogonadism, which he was diagnosed with later in life. After being diagnosed with GHS, he began testosterone replacement therapy, TRT, to improve his endocrine condition. This treatment aims to address hormones deficiencies associated with the syndrome by restoring testosterone levels, thereby helping to stabilize the patient's hormonal balance and improve related symptoms. Shortly after initiating TRT, his behavior underwent a dramatic change. Well, yeah, he's had low T for most of his life, and at 77, they give him some, including increased irritability, mood swings, and the onset of sexual impulses, and behaviors that he struggled to regulate and understand due to his low IQ and previously documented disability. Neuropsychology assessments revealed significant deficits in metacognition and social cognition, which rendered him unable to understand the legal or moral consequences of his actions. This profound impairment highlights his difficulty in grasping complex cognitive and social processes, essentially for moral and legal judgment. His response to confrontations about his behavior reflected his intellectual limitations and childlike understanding. For instance, he expressed that he would not mind going to prison if he could continue his fishing hobby while incarcerated. Yeah, he doesn't have that capacity. He doesn't have that ability. Idiopathics do, though. Insanity, evaluation, and pedophilic disorder. It now remains to be clarified whether the differences addressed above should have different legal implications. It is thus of the utmost importance to understand how insanity can be evaluated in these offenders. Different standards of insanity plea. The insanity difference is a legal doctrine through which a defendant acknowledges having committed the act in question, but denies criminal responsibility on the grounds of a mental disorder. Each country or jurisdiction defies its own legal criteria for establishing insanity, and these criteria vary considerably across legal systems. Among the best-known formulations are the Manhattan Rule and the Model Penal Code, MPC test. According to the Manhattan Rule, a defendant affected by mental illness may be found not guilty by reason of sanity if at the time of the crime they either did not understand the nature of their act or did not know that their act was wrong. Like the previous case we just read. The MPC test is contrast, adapts a broader two-pronged approach stating that, see, this is a problem when it's broad, because of how specific this disorder is. A person who is not responsible for a criminal conduct if at the time of such conduct, as a result of mental disease or deficit, he lacks substantial capacity either to appreciate the criminality, wrongfulness of his conduct, or to conform his conduct to the requirements of law. Well, with that, or to conform his conduct to the requirements of law, that almost sounds like idiopathic because they conform their behavior to avoid the law. The MPC standard, by introducing a two-pronged test, represented a significant evolution from earlier models and has since been adopted with local adaptations in several jurisdictions, including Italy. Nonetheless, it is important to acknowledge that alternative approaches exist. For example, Sweden still lacks a formal legal standard for insanity. In Italy, Article 88, the Penal Code declares that a person who, at the time of the act, was in such a mental state due to infirmity that they lacked the capacity to understand or to will is not criminally responsible, closely aligning with the MPC standard. Accordingly, this paper refers to the Italian model, given its conceptual proximity to the MPC and its emphasis on cognitive faculties as the cornerstone of legal sanity. The prevailing approach to insanity evaluations in cases of child sexual offenses. A prevailing international perspective holds that idiopathic pedophilic disorder does not inherently impair an individual's self-determination, meaning that people with this nosographic diagnosis are typically considered fully responsible for their criminal actions. This view was enshrined in Italy law with a groundbreaking ruling by the Supreme Court of Cassation against the perpetrator who sexually abused a minor. In the Italian legal system, the Supreme Court of Cassation plays a decisive role in ensuring the uniformity of legal interpretation. Although the principle of stare decisis does not formally apply in Italy as it does in common law systems, where the courts are bound by precedents in similar cases. The rulings of the Court of Cassation serve as authoritative guidelines for the lower courts. Yeah, so we use case law here. Although not legally binding, these decisions are highly influential as lower courts tend to align with them to prevent annulments or appeal. Annulments on appeal. In 2003, ruling explicitly stated, the defendant, also given his criminal record, was inclined to pedophilia, but an automatic consequence of lack of or diminished capacity to understand and to will is not rightly inferred from this. Furthermore, it asserted, although it is true that pedophilia, as a modification of the sexual object towards minors, ordinarily presents a habitual nature, for criminal purposes this condition neither excludes nor mitigates the capacity to understand and will, and consequently, criminal responsibility of sexual abuse against minors. This decision established a legal precedent in Italy, affirming that a diagnosis of idiopathic pedophilic disorder does not have an impact on individuals' capacity for intentional and volitional control. Consequently, individuals who have a pedophilic disorder and commit sexual offenses against children are presumed fully responsible for their actions. This gap poses a major challenge when assessing insanity in defendants charged with sexual offenses against children. Current diagnostic criteria do not include the exclusion clause typically found in other psychiatric disorders, namely, that the symptoms are not attributable to the psychological effects of another substance or to another medical condition. Physiological effects. As a result, the current diagnostic framework does not formally recognize acquired or iatrogenic forms of pedophilic disorder. Consequently, during insanity evaluations, forensic experts adhering to the prevailing approach, which primarily relies on a categorical psychiatric diagnosis, often assume that all individuals who commit such offenses poses intact capacity for foresight and behavioral control. This reliance on nosographic diagnosis rather than the case-specific functional assessments tends to oversimplify complex clinical presentations and overlook circumstances in which an individual's neurological, genetic, or psychological condition may have substantially compromised their ability to self-determine. The importance of the application of a cognitive approach to insanity evaluation in cases of child sexual offenses. In paragraph 2, we highlighted how idiopathic pedophilic disorders differs from acquired and iatrogenic, one in etiology, neural basis, associated cognitive dysfunction, and modus operandi. These differences are also critically important for forensic reasoning during insanity evaluation. Regarding idiopathic pedophilic disorder, the literature indicates that these individuals do not present consistent or clinically significant brain alterations. While some studies have identified subtle cognitive peculiarities on neuropsychological testing, these differences appear to have no measurable impact on everyday functioning or behavioral control. Moreover, their modus operandi clearly reflects preserved cognitive abilities and intact executive functioning. So they don't have executive dysfunction, they have intact executive functioning. In particular, individuals with idiopathic pedophilic disorder retain intact intellectual and executive functions, allowing them to recognize risk factors and avoid situations in which acting on their impulses could lead to criminal behavior. These offenders are generally capable of understanding both themselves and others, including mental states, intentions, and beliefs, as well as distinguishing right from wrong and recognizing the moral and legal implications of their impulses. This is reflected in their modus operandi, which typically involves strategic behavior, such as concealing their actions, avoiding detection, and manipulating victims, suggesting deliberate strategic planning and a clear understanding of the wrongfulness of their actions. Amen. Moreover, their capacity for volitional control allows them to suppress their urges until circumstances facilitate offending, reinforcing the conclusion that their actions stem from intentional decision making. This is what we're dealing with. These types, the 3 to 5% who do the most damage, who know what they're doing. In contrast, individuals with acquired pedophilic disorder exhibit markedly different neurocognitive and behavioral profile. The literature consistently reports brain alterations in regions implicated in behavioral inhibition and social cognition, accompanied by clear cognitive impairments such as disinhibition and deficits in moral reasoning. These dysfunctions show a robust and anatomical clinical correlation with the underlying neural abnormalities. Unlike the subtle, subclinical findings occasionally observed in idiopathic cases, the cognitive deficits in acquired pedophilic disorder are readily detectable through neuropsychological assessment and manifest prominently in real-life behavior. Their modus operandi is typically characterized by high impulsivity, lack of planning, and absence of concealment strategies, reflecting a substantial loss of cognitive control. More specifically, individuals with acquired pedophilic disorder may fail to recognize the moral and legal wrongfulness of their sexual impulses, often acting openly without apparent awareness of their consequences. A striking example is provided by a case in which the defendant was apprehended while masturbating outside a schoolyard. Importantly, while idiopathic offenders often engage in strategic grooming of their victims and take precautions to avoid detection, individuals with pedophilic disorders of organic etiology typically act in an impulsive and often disorganized manner, even when some level of awareness is retained. These individuals often describe their sexual urges as overpowering and uncontrollable, highlighting a profound disturbance in impulse regulation. To summarize, an acquired pedophilic disorder, but not in the idiopathic form, a clear correspondence should be found between 3 levels of evidence: the neural network disrupted by the neurological insult, the behavioral manifestations observed in daily life, and the modus operandi associated with the offense. Indeed, in these cases, the affected brain regions are typically those involved in social cognition and impulse control, functions that are crucial for moral reasoning and behavioral regulation. Consequently, offenders often display real-life impairments in these domains, and their offending behavior is characteristically impulsive, disorganized, and lacking in premeditation. This relationship is conceptually summarized in the neurocognitive model of acquired pedophilic disorder, illustrated in Figure 1. In response to the limitations of the traditional framework and its assumption that pedophilic disorders almost never affect an individual's ability to understand and will, we propose an alternative approach, referred to below as the cognitive approach. This approach breaks down the legal concept of capacity to understand and will into two distinct cognitive functions that can be individually assessed and quantitatively measured. Indeed, since insanity is explicitly determined by these key capacities, both of which are inherently cognitive, it follows that the assessment of sanity should also be based on cognitive constructs. By applying this model, forensic experts, both expert witnesses and judges, can differentiate between the different forms of pedophilic disorder and identify their different profiles without over-reliance on nasographic diagnosis. This is particularly important given that in the case of pedophilia, current diagnostic clarifications present significant limitations as discussed in the introduction. Specifically, the nasographic framework fails to recognize acquired paraphilic disorder as a distinct condition, since the current diagnostic manuals lack an exclusion criteria. Specifically, that symptoms must not be attributable to another medical or neurological condition. And it's also going to be important that these experts that come into our courts, like we saw in the Karen Reed, the experts that the state brought in were not experts. The experts that Karen Reed brought in were professional, they were experienced, they had a methodology, they were firm but flexible, they were specific. We need professionals. We need experienced professionals to be in the court. And not these pseudoscience nimrods. Given the unique behavioral, neuropsychological, and in some cases, neurobiological characteristics of each variant of pedophilic disorder, a thorough psychoforensic assessment is essential. This evaluation must carefully determine to extent to which cognitive faculties, including impulse control, underlying decision-making, are impaired and assess whether the criteria for a mental deficit are met in each individual case. Our hope is that contemporary legal frameworks for insanity will increasingly acknowledge that insanity is fundamentally a cognitive, other than juridical construct. Well, yeah, hello. I can't believe that this is just... Accordingly, evaluations of insanity should actively integrate the cognitive profiles of defendants, taking into account how these profiles influence their behavior at the time of the offense. Practical application of the cognitive approach. A practical application of the cognitive approach to the three court cases presented above attempts to clarify the psychoforensic consideration underlying the framework. The case of the idiopathic pedophilic disorder. So let's see here. Capacity to understand and to will, disinhibition, change in sexual orientation, social cognition effect. And then they show the brain scans here. All right, so let's see here. The case of the idiopathic pedophilic disorder. The British man's story represents a clear example of a case in which no underlying medical conditions or substance-related factors were identified that could provide an alternative explanation for his actions. According to the classical nasographic prevalent approach to insanity, individuals with idiopathic pedophilic are to be considered sane, as this condition do not impact on the ability to understand and to will. Yeah, because they're sane. they're very well aware of what they're doing. They're strategic. They are planning. They know what they're doing. And they do what they can to stay out of trouble. Although a formal assessment of insanity was not conducted, his criminal conduct was characterized by a high degree of planning, deception, and self-control, underscoring his full awareness of the wrongfulness of his actions. His deliberate selection of victims, strategic grooming tactics, and active efforts to evade detection demonstrate intact impulse control and moral reasoning, all of which indicate that his actions stemmed from intrinsic motivations rather than cognitive or neurological dysfunction, thus representing an emblematic case of idiopathic pedophilic disorder. He therefore had the responsibility to avoid situations that could lead to contact with children, thereby minimizing the risk of acting on his impulses. When analyzed in terms of its cognitive components, his modus operandi revealed pronounced planning abilities, effective inhibitory control, demonstrated by his capacity to suppress his sexual impulses until a suitable opportunity arose, and a clear awareness of the wrongfulness of his actions, as evidenced by his efforts to avoid detection. He was ultimately found guilty and sentenced to 22 life sentences. Okay. The case of the acquired pedophilic disorder. During the formal insanity evaluation, the experts appointed by the judge applied a nosographic model, diagnosing the man with idiopathic pedophilic disorder and arguing that acquired pedophilic disorder is extremely rare and not universally recognized in the literature. Consequently, they attributed his neurological symptoms to hysterical origins and interpreted the emergence of his sexual interest as a novel manifestation, reasoning that his sexuality was in decline due to senescence, and this promoted the insurgence of extravagant sexual manifestation. They're reaching. Based on this assessment, they ultimately deemed him fully sane. Stop. See, this is dangerous. On the contrary, by applying the cognitive model of insanity and breaking down his modus operandi into its cognitive components, it is clear that his behavior at the time of the crime was entirely devoid of premeditation, organization, or any attempt to conceal his actions, thus revealing a high degree of impulsivity and a deficit of social cognition. In this regard, neuropsychological assessment confirmed the presence of impairments in emotion attribution, moral reasoning, and abstract thinking, all of which significantly compromise his ability to foresee the consequences of his actions and regulate his behavior. Additionally, reports from third parties corroborated pervasive impulse discontrol in everyday life, such as he started to steal umbrellas from shops, reinforcing the conclusion that his volitional and cognitive faculties were severely impaired, lacking the ability to comprehend the moral and legal wrongfulness of his actions and experiencing a profound loss of. Yeah, just from hearing the two differences about, while they're saying his sexuality was in decline due to whatever, makes no sense. Just making shit up what you think is true, but not having any grounds of why you think that's true or making any sense of why you think that's true. Whereas this is showing a pattern. Stealing umbrellas, stealing postcards, looking up child pornography, then started touching. Like, it showed a pattern that they were not being self-aware of what they were doing. Lacking the ability to comprehend the moral and legal wrongfulness of his actions and experiencing a profound loss of impulse control. The defendant was unable to make a conscious and deliberate choice to avoid situations that could lead to offending. Although the tumor provided a medical explanation for these impairments, it was the resulting cognitive dysfunction, not simply the presence of the tumor itself, that led to the inability to self-determine. Initially sentenced to 5 years in prison, the man's appeal resulted in a reduction to 2 years and 8 months, with the Court of Appeal recognizing mitigating circumstances. However, his medical condition was not among the factors considered in this decision, which is a damn fucking shame. I understand getting the time because he did traumatize a victim. Absolutely. He should definitely get time for that. But to not use the medical condition, which was clear, is irresponsible and not ethical. The case of the iatrogenic pedophilic disorder. I'm feeling a little off because of the spring forward. During the formal insanity evaluation, the expert appointed by the judge applied a nosographic model, failing to recognize the possibility of iatrogenic pedophilic disorder. The assessment focused solely on observed behavior without investigating the potential link between pharmacological treatment and the emergence of a de novo sexual impulses, which the defendant had never exhibited prior to treatment for GHS. On the contrary, adopting a cognitive model of insanity and analysis his modus operandi in terms of cognitive components, it becomes evident that TRT, administered to treat the rare genetic condition, induced a form of delayed puberty. That is, the appearance of sexually impulses resembling those experienced during adolescence, which were previously absent. These new impulses, coupled with the defendant's low intellectual functioning, social impairments, immaturity, infantile social attitudes, and severe deficit in metacognition and mentalization, significantly impaired his ability to recognize their inappropriateness and to exercise proper control over them. Neuropsychology testing confirmed significant difficulties in recognizing inappropriate behavior, understanding others' mental states, and regulating actions. The defense successfully argued that neither TRT nor the individual's pre-existing cognitive impairments alone would have led to the offenses. However, their interaction created a state in which his ability to regulate behavior was compromised. The Italian court fully embraced this reasoning, determining that the defendant was legally insane at the time of the offenses. The court recognized that his actions were the result of an interaction between his medical condition, cognitive impairment, and pharmacological effects, and acquitted him of all criminal charges, considering him not guilty by reason of insanity. These case studies illustrate the importance of adopting a forensic evaluation framework that integrates behavioral, neuropsychological, and medical evidence rather than relying on rigid, nosographic categorization. The cognitive approach, providing evidence for different cognitive underpinnings in idiopathic versus acquired iatrogenic pedophilic disorder, offers a scientifically grounded methodology for distinguishing between cases in which offenders retain full criminal responsibility and those in which underlying psychopathological, neurological, or pharmacological factors substantially impairs volitional and cognitive capacities. Despite the attention and importance given to decision-making ability in the scientific literature, not only has the cognitive approach not been shared by all experts, but it has also not yet been translated into laws or guidelines used by lawyers, juries, and judges in their decision-making process. Neglecting these cognitive aspects can lead to individuals, such those with pedophilic disorder, being automatically considered criminally liable solely on the basis of their diagnosis, and sometimes based solely on the crime they committed, without their decision-making ability being adequately assessed. Absolutely. And when you're being cognitively aware and being deceitful, deceptive, grooming, more of a punishment. Legal implications of pedophilic disorder. It is crucial to highlight that the presence of a cognitive disorder or neurological condition does not automatically absolve an individual from legal responsibility, nor should it be used as a convenient excuse for avoiding accountability. They are fully aware of what's going on in the world. It now remains to be clarified whether the differences addressed above should have different legal implications. The discussion thus far, along with findings of the 2023 International Consensus Conference on Acquired Pedophilia, supports the conclusion that offenders with acquired pedophilic disorder might be found not guilty by reason of insanity. This reasoning extends to iatrogenic pedophilic disorder, which shares the same clinical features and forensic implications as its acquired counterpart, differing only in etiology, as highlighted by experts in the guidelines on acquired pedophilia. Forensic assessments must focus on whether the individuals possessed the cognitive abilities, including the volitional one, which is a cognitive ability in itself, necessary to control their impulses at the time of the offense and to understand the legal and moral wrongfulness of their offenses. The onset of disinhibition, induced by the organic condition or medical intervention, usually accompanied by impairments in moral reasoning, creates a clear behavioral fracture between the pre- and post-disease periods. When self-regulation mechanisms fail due to an external cause, the individual's capacity for self-determination is compromised. Yeah, cause and effect. Hello. Legal conclusions regarding pedophilic disorders have significant implications for societal approaches to risk management and rehabilitation. Even in legal systems that prioritize retribution, individuals who successfully establish legal insanity are exempt from punitive sanctions. For this reason, accurately distinguishing idiopathic from acquired and iatrogenic forms of pedophilia disorder is essential, because it prevents the inappropriate punishment of persons whose illnesses substantially impair their capacity for self-control, while ensuring the responsibility and sanction are applied where cognitive capacities were intact, like the idiopathic. The jurisdictions that emphasize rehabilitations and public protection rather than strict retribution, imprisonment of individuals with acquired and iatrogenic pedophilic disorder is often an inappropriate response, as the offending behavior stems from an underlying medical condition. Incarceration is not only jeopardizing the individual's well-being, particularly in cases where the neurological condition progresses unfavorably, but also fails to fulfill the primary objectives of many penal systems: rehabilitation and integration into society. This failure occurs for two key reasons. First, an acquired pedophilic disorder symptoms cannot remit until the underlying neurological pathology is addressed. Without medical intervention, the impulsivity and disinhibitions driving the behavior persist, rendering punitive measures ineffective in preventing recidivism. Second, many individuals with acquired or iatrogenic pedophilic disorder lack awareness of the illegality and immorality of their actions. This not only undermines the deterrent effect of incarceration, but maintains a high risk of reoffending, as they remain unaware of the need for behavioral change. Furthermore, a scientifically accurate interpretation of pedophilic disorder may alleviate the intense social stigma associated with a diagnosis of pedophilia, both for the offender and their family. Understanding the neurological basis of acquired pedophilia helps contextualize the sexual deviant behavior, shifting the focus from moral condemnation to medical intervention. A more appropriate alternative to incarceration is placement in specialized healthcare facilities where the underlying neurological disorder can be treated, or drug therapy can be reassessed. Such interventions can lead to complete remission of pedophilic behavior and a substantial reduction in recidivism risk. Now, I do remember a time where there was like this movement of some sorts to be more understanding of pedophilia and be more proactive about giving pedophiles a chance. When you put it that way, it's going to turn people off. You can't just do a slogan like that. It was weird when it came out, and I vaguely remember it, but I remember it was not landing very well. This is something that's totally different. This is a medical cause, an underlying medical rationale. The acquired and iatrogenic. The idiopathic is what we're dealing with right now with the Epstein. They are very much well aware of what they're doing, and they do not get any sympathy whatsoever. The acquired and iatrogenic, they still committed the act. They shouldn't get life in prison. The acquired did get it because, it did cause trauma onto a victim, even though he wasn't aware. He still got time. A few years. Hopefully in a facility, not in like a hardcore prison, because that would not be appropriate. Beyond legal responsibility and societal risk management, the victim's perspective must also be considered in discussion of pedophilic disorder within the justice system. Too often, victims' experiences are overlooked in forensic evaluations and legal decisions. Hello. Despite the profound and lasting impact of these offenses, the Consensus Conference on Acquired Pedophilia found that 84.6% of the experts involved agreed on the importance of incorporating the victim's perspective into discussion of forensic evaluations and sentencing decisions. Understanding the underlying medical and psychological mechanisms that contribute to an offender's behavior may help victims process their trauma and engage more effectively in psychological rehabilitation. Absolutely. Research suggests that when victims gain a clearer understanding of legal reasoning and sentencing decisions, they experience less distress and a greater sense of justice, which can positively influence their mental health and recovery. Recognizing how cognitive and neurological impairments may shape offending behavior does not diminish the severity of the crime, nor does it negate the harm suffered by victims. Rather, it ensures that justice is informed by scientific accuracy, promoting a legal framework that is both evidence-based and ethically sound. Lovely. Like I was just saying. And we just had a new Epstein come out about Trump and the victim, where the FBI talked to her and saying, well, are you going to give your story even though nothing's going to happen? Which is bullshit. That's awful. How do we treat people like that? That just perpetuates the idiopathic pedophilia. You're giving them an out and stepping on the victim. Guidelines for forensic evaluation of insanity in child sexual offenses. All right. I said take a break and get something to eat. Guidelines for forensic evaluation of insanity in child sexual offenses. Building on our analysis of pedophilic disorder and its legal implications, we have developed a set of guidelines to assist forensic experts in conducting insanity evaluations for child sexual offenses case. These guidelines incorporate key insights from the present analysis alongside recommendations from the International Consensus Conference on Acquired Pedophilic and establish guidelines on the use of neuroimaging, and forensic evaluations. The following guidelines aim to provide a comprehensive framework that addresses the complexities of differentiating between idiopathic, acquired, and iatrogenic pedophilic disorders in legal contexts. These guidelines are designed to 1. Enhance the accuracy of forensic differential assessments. 2. Ensure appropriate consideration of each form of psychological or medical conditions. 3. Support more informed legal decision making. And 3. Okay. So, initial screening. Conduct an initial screening of the case by thoroughly reviewing the case files and, if possible, conducting a clinical interview with the defendant. The aim is to assess the presence of the following red flags identified by Campirio, Ciani, et al. 2019. Absence of attempts to conceal the crime, lack of premeditation, no prior history of sexual offenses, spontaneous confessions or absence of denial, expression of guilt or remorse, age over 50. If at least three out of these 6 red flags are present, proceed simultaneously with steps 2, 3, and 4. So 2, behavioral analysis. Conduct a forensic assessment of the offender's modus operandi, paying particular attention to presence or absence of premeditation, evidence of grooming behaviors, impulsivity of actions, attempt to conceal the offense and presence of denial, victim selection patterns, active targeting versus proximity-based encounters. 3. Amnesic investigation. Anamnesis investigation. Examine the onset and progression of sexual behaviors towards children by assessing whether the behavioral changes coincide with neurological events or medication use, the individual's medical history, focusing on neurological, psychiatric, or psychological conditions that may be linked to the offenses, third-party observations from family members, caregivers, or others close to the defendant regarding noticeable behavioral changes in daily life. And here they have it here. Step 1, no, yes. A graphical summary of the guidelines. All right, last page here. And 4, comprehensive cognitive assessment. Administer a neuropsychological evaluation assessing impulse control, social cognition and moral reasoning, executive functions, malingering. If the findings from steps 2, 3, and 4 indicate a medical or psychological condition with a plausible causal link to the crime and malingering has been ruled out, proceed to step 5, neurological evaluation. Conduct a comprehensive neurological examination to identify any organic pathologies that may contribute to cognitive or behavioral manifestations, either independently or as a result of medical treatment. This evaluation may include targeted laboratory tests such as neuroimaging, MRI, PET scan, genetic analysis for relevant polymorphism, and blood tests to assess metabolic or pharmacological influences. Examination of prescribed medications or interventions and their potential neuropsychiatric side effects. If the neurological examination identifies an organic pathology or a medical treatment likely to be associated with the behavioral profile observed, proceed to step 6. Causal analysis of factors leading to criminal behavior. Assess whether the combination of cognitive behavioral disorders and or the underlying medical pathology treatment created the conditions under which the offense occurred. Alternative explanations to support the individual's capacity to understand and to will at the time of the offense and have been systematically considered, discussed, and excluded. If the analysis supports a causal link between the disorder and the criminal act, and no alternative explanation substantiates full criminal responsibility, carefully consider answering the judge's question by arguing insanity at the time of the offense, then proceed to point 7. Risk assessment and treatment considerations. Based on the nature of the disorder, Idiopathic Acquired or Iatrogenic assesses the types of criminogenic needs, the level of social dangerousness, the most appropriate legal and rehabilitative response, considering whether treatment in a specialized medical facility rather than the imprisonment is warranted. These guidelines are not only useful to discriminate idiopathic from acquired and iatrogenic pedophilic disorders, but are also extremely helpful in disentangling whether a pedophilic act is committed due to a neurological insult or by a person with a neurological insult. Indeed, there are cases where offenders with neurological insults committed pedophilic offenses, but the commission of these criminal acts is not the consequence of their neurological condition. Credits, authorship, and contribution statement. Also, they tell you like what their roles were. So, code availability, software application, and custom code. Nope. Funding. This research did not receive any specific grant from funding agencies in the public, commercial, or non-for-profit sectors. Wow. So they did this on their own. They weren't paid by anyone. Totally objective. Declaration of competing interests. The authors declare they have no competing interests. And data availability. So there you go. Whew. So I didn't read the last 2 pages on my own before I read them to you. So I'm just looking at this last paragraph. For some reason, it's tripping me up. These guidelines are not only useful to discriminate idiopathic from acquired and iatrogenic pedophilic disorders, but are also extremely helpful in disentangling whether a pedophilic act is committed due to a neurological insult or by a person with a neurological insult. Oh, okay. Idiopathic and then non. Indeed, there are cases where offenders with neurological insults commit pedophilic offenses, but the commission of these criminal acts is not the consequence of a neurological condition. Okay. It's just they changed up the wording a little, so it just threw me off for a second. So there you go. And then my ice machine just goes off. Whew. I enjoyed this paper. Comprehensive, easy to understand, clear and concise. An outline of how to use it yourself. Anyone could follow it, especially a lawyer or a judge. Specific. And if you want to look more into it, if you have more questions and want to understand how they got there, well, guess what? You got all of these references to look at and to do your own research to see how they got there from many different disciplines and professionals. So, there you go. Let me know in the comments what you thought. I will be doing the Upper East Side, the Jeffrey Epstein, my analysis of it. I wanted to do this pedophilic disorder because I did Little St. James. There are 2 photographers with that one as well. And I saw some patterns there that brought me to this. And also because I read about the laws that we have here in the US in regards to pedophilia and the symptoms of it and the escalation and how much it lacked certain ones. And I saw that within the Upper East Side townhouse, the Little St. James compound. And I'm now doing, right now this has a bunch of different photos that I'm going through. And I started seeing some patterns there. So this will be good to use to reference to. And I'm also going to do this as well in the future, which is aggression and violence behavior. This is 2019. The grooming of children for sexual abuse in religious settings, unique characteristics, and select case studies. So I took a quick look at this. I believe I'm going to use this one. If not, I'll find a different one, but this definitely was brought to my attention, especially with that Tim Tebow, with his missionary work, the amount of religious institutions that have been known for sexual abuse. And this will help with understanding with just the Jeffrey Epstein, but also with the current administration, because there are several references towards religious affirmations. And especially now we are now back at a religious war, which we were back in, I want to say, in the 80s. So this is just, we're in a cycle. We're in a cycle of abuse right now, and we can get out of this cycle. So thank you very much for listening. Let me know in the comments what you thought about this paper, and you'll be hearing from me soon. Thank you again for listening.